Hey, welcome back. I'm glad you're here today because I want to have an honest conversation with you. The kind of conversation that, frankly, most doctors don't have time to have in a 15-minute office visit. For the last 4 decades, we have been handed a set of dietary rules. Rules about fat being the enemy, rules about calories being all that matters, rules about eating low-fat yogurt and counting every single number on a nutrition label. And most of us, including me, early in my career, followed those rules. We told our patients to follow those rules, and yet, rates of obesity went up. Type 2 diabetes exploded. Heart disease, metabolic syndrome, autoimmune conditions, all of them trending in the wrong direction. We did what we were told, and we got sicker. So today, I want to walk you through something genuinely significant that is happening right now in the world of nutritional science and federal health policy. The U.S. Dietary Guidelines, those official recommendations that shape everything from school lunch programs to hospital meal plans, are going through the most meaningful revision in a generation. And buried inside these updates are 6 shifts that I think every single person watching this needs to understand. I'm going to be direct with you. Some of this is going to challenge things you have believed for a long time. Some of it might frustrate you, because if it's true, it means we wasted a lot of years on bad advice. But I think you deserve the truth, and I think your body deserves better than what the system has been offering. The single most consequential change in these new guidelines, and I want you to really hear this, is that for the first time, the U.S. government is explicitly naming highly processed and ultra-processed foods as a primary driver of chronic disease in America. Now, if you're sitting there thinking, okay, we've always kind of known junk food is bad, I want you to pause, because this is actually much bigger than that. Think about what it means for an official government document to say that ultra-processed foods, we're talking refined carbohydrates, added sugars, chemical additives, emulsifiers, artificial dyes, artificial sweeteners, are at the root of our national health crisis. By naming these things specifically, the guidelines are pointing a finger at the most profitable products in the entire grocery store. These are products built on heavily subsidized commodity crops: corn, soy, wheat, billions of dollars of government money flowing into the very supply chain that produces the food we're now being told is making us sick. Dr. Mark Hyman, one of the leading voices in functional medicine, said something that really stuck with me when these guidelines were being discussed. He said, "Of course the industry is furious about this, because it puts them in the crosshairs by saying highly processed food is not something you should eat, period." That's unbelievably revolutionary. It's something I never thought I would see in my lifetime. And I share that sentiment. I genuinely did not expect to see this level of directness from a federal agency that has historically been very, very careful not to upset the food industry's apple cart. Or should I say, their corn syrup cart. It means the next time you pick up something at the grocery store and the ingredients list reads like a chemistry textbook, with names you can't pronounce, with numbers and codes and artificial flavors, that is now, officially, something the government is saying you should not eat. Not eat in moderation, not be mindful of, not eating it, full stop. This is the kind of clarity that has been absent from public health messaging for decades. And while the guidelines are a floor, not a ceiling, this shift creates a foundation that I believe will change the way we talk about food in this country for a long time. All right, let's talk about the second shift. And this one is near and dear to my heart because I have had this argument with colleagues so many times. For as long as I can remember, mainstream dietary advice has been built on what I call the simple math model of nutrition. Calories in versus calories out. You eat too much, you gain weight. You eat too little, you lose weight. It didn't matter what the food was. 100 calories from a can of soda was the same as 100 calories from a handful of almonds. The math is the math, right? Wrong. Completely wrong. And the new guidelines are finally acknowledging this. Here's the key piece of science you need to understand. Controlled trials, meaning carefully designed experiments where researchers control exactly what people eat, have shown that people on ultra-processed diets consume significantly more calories and gain significantly more weight than people on whole food diets, even when the total calories and the macronutrient breakdown are identical on paper. Read that again. Same calories, same protein, fat, and carbohydrate ratios. Different food quality, completely different metabolic outcomes. Why? Because different foods do fundamentally different things to your hormones. They signal different things to your hunger centers in the brain. They affect your insulin levels differently. They influence your gut microbiome differently. Food is not just fuel. Food is information. Every bite you take is sending a message to your cells, your hormones, your immune system. When you eat a bowl of steel-cut oats, your body gets a very different message than when you eat a bowl of processed breakfast cereal with the same number of calories. The oats say, here is slow energy, here are fibers that feed your gut bacteria, here are minerals. The cereal says, here is a spike in blood sugar, here is an insulin surge, here are chemicals that confuse your appetite signals. The practical upshot of this is enormous. If you focus on the quality of what you eat, real, whole, unprocessed foods, you largely don't need to obsessively track calories. Your body's own hunger and satiety signals, which have been refined over hundreds of thousands of years of evolution, will start to work the way they're supposed to work. The calorie math takes care of itself. This is something I've watched happen with patients over and over again in clinical practice. The moment they stop eating food-like products and start eating actual food, they stop overeating, not because they're trying harder, but because their biology starts functioning correctly. Now, let's talk about protein, because the updated recommendations here represent a shift from what I think of as survival medicine to optimal medicine. And that distinction matters a lot. For decades, the recommended dietary allowance for protein was calculated based on the minimum amount needed to prevent deficiency. The bare floor, basically. Don't let people get sick. That was the bar. The new guidelines are starting to push towards something more ambitious. Optimal health, optimal function, optimal longevity. The updated recommendations suggest somewhere between 1.2 and 1.6 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight. For most of us, that's roughly 0.7 to 1 gram per pound of ideal body weight. And importantly, the higher end of that range, around 1.6 grams per kilogram, is specifically targeted for people who are doing resistance training or who are pregnant. I want to explain why this matters so much, because I don't think most people appreciate how fundamentally important muscle is to long-term health. In functional medicine, we have this concept of muscle as the currency of longevity. And I mean that very literally, not as a metaphor. Let me give you 3 reasons why. First, think of your muscles as a metabolic sink for blood sugar. Every time you eat carbohydrates, glucose enters your bloodstream. Your body needs to move that glucose out of the blood and into storage. The primary place it goes? Your muscles. The more lean muscle mass you have, the larger that sink is, and the more efficiently your body can clear glucose from the bloodstream. This directly reduces your risk of insulin resistance, prediabetes, and type 2 diabetes. So muscle is not just about looking good, it's literally protecting your metabolic health. Second, protein has a significantly higher thermic effect than carbohydrates or fat. What that means is that your body burns considerably more energy just in the process of digesting and metabolizing protein. You are literally burning more calories from the act of processing the food before it even does anything else in your body. This is part of why high-protein diets are so consistently effective for body composition. Third, and this is the one people often don't think about, Protein is incredibly powerful for satiety. It is the most satiating macronutrient, bar none. When you eat adequate protein, it triggers the release of hormones that communicate fullness to your brain. You simply don't want to keep eating. This makes high-protein diets naturally self-regulating in a way that high-carbohydrate diets simply are not. So if you take nothing else from today's video, take this. Make sure you are eating enough protein. Prioritize it at every meal. It's not just for athletes and bodybuilders. It is foundational to your metabolic health, your body composition, and your long-term function. Okay, I want to talk about fat, because this is the one that has probably caused more confusion and more harm in public health messaging than almost anything else over the last 50 years. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, a dietary hypothesis became official government policy. Fat, particularly saturated fat, was the enemy. Eating fat made you fat. Eating saturated fat gave you heart disease. The solution? Replace fat with carbohydrates. Eat low-fat everything. What followed was one of the great unintended disasters in public health history. Food manufacturers, responding to the low-fat mandate, stripped the fat out of their products and replaced it with sugar, refined carbohydrates, and additives to make the food palatable again. The grocery stores filled up with fat-free cookies, low-fat yogurt loaded with high-fructose corn syrup, reduced-fat crackers made with processed flour. And we ate them, because the package said low-fat and the government had told us fat was the problem. The result? The obesity epidemic accelerated. Type 2 diabetes skyrocketed. We got measurably sicker. Now, to their credit, the new guidelines are finally retreating from the institutional fear of fat, particularly in the context of dairy. The science now shows, and this is a fairly robust body of evidence, that full-fat dairy is linked to neutral or even beneficial metabolic outcomes, particularly when it comes to diabetes risk. The fear of the fat in butter and cheese and full-fat yogurt is not supported by the evidence. However, and I have to be honest with you here, because there is an important nuance, the guidelines also still recommend 3 servings of dairy per day as universally beneficial. And I have real issues with that recommendation, because approximately 75% of the world's population has some degree of lactose intolerance. Universally beneficial is not a phrase that should be applied to something that the majority of the global population cannot adequately digest. But let me give you the 2 most important practical takeaways from this section. First, context matters enormously with saturated fat. Butter on a piece of white bread? That combination, saturated fat paired with refined starch and sugar, appears to be genuinely problematic metabolically. The fat and the sugar together create a toxic synergy. But butter on broccoli? The science suggests that is generally neutral or even healthy. So it's not the butter that's the villain, it's the white bread. Second, individual variation is real, and it is clinically significant. In practice, I have seen patients reduce their cholesterol by over 100 points on a diet high in saturated fat from whole food sources like butter and coconut oil. I have also seen other patients whose numbers go in a very bad direction on the same diet. Your genetics, your metabolic history, your gut microbiome, all of these modulate how your body responds to dietary fat. This is a perfect example of why one-size-fits-all dietary guidelines will always be inadequate for a portion of the population. This is the section I'm probably most passionate about, because it touches something that I believe is the single most underdiagnosed condition in modern medicine. Buried deep inside the new dietary guidelines, almost like the authors were a little nervous to say it too loudly, is a single sentence that I consider to be a major admission. Some people with chronic disease may benefit from lower carbohydrate diets. Now that sentence might sound modest, but I want you to understand what it is acknowledging. It is acknowledging the existence of what researchers call carbohydrate intolerance, a state of hormonal dysregulation, specifically around insulin, where a person's body cannot efficiently process starch and sugar without significant metabolic harm. And emerging research suggests this condition, in varying degrees of severity, affects somewhere in the range of 93% of the American population. We are not talking about a rare genetic condition that affects a small minority. We are talking about a near-universal state of metabolic dysfunction, driven in large part by decades of a high-carbohydrate, ultra-processed food environment. For people with carbohydrate intolerance, starch and sugar are not just extra calories. They function metabolically more like toxins, triggering insulin spikes, promoting fat storage, driving inflammation, and accelerating the progression of chronic disease. Now, we're also starting to see a shift in how the guidelines think about grains, specifically whole grains, which have been a dietary sacred cow for decades. The guidelines still recommend whole grains, but there is growing acknowledgement that they are not essential human foods in the way that protein and fat are. We evolved as a species for approximately 200,000 years without agriculture, without grain cultivation, without eating bread or pasta or cereal. These are relatively recent additions to the human diet. And for people with autoimmune conditions, for people with insulin resistance, for people with type 2 diabetes, even whole grains can be genuinely harmful. The strongest proof of concept I can point to here is the work coming out of companies like Virta Health, which uses a medically supervised ketogenic diet, high fat, very low carbohydrate, to treat type 2 diabetes. Their published data shows a 60% remission rate for type 2 diabetes, with 90 to 100% of patients reducing or eliminating their medications entirely. 60% remission for a disease that mainstream medicine has told patients is chronic and progressive for generations. Not managed, remitted. These are people whose doctors told them this disease would only get worse, and instead it got better, by simply changing the macronutrient composition of what they ate. That is not a small finding. That is a paradigm-shifting finding. And the fact that it's beginning to seep into official dietary guidelines, even in cautious, hedged language, is significant. I want to spend a few minutes on what I consider to be one of the most empowering shifts in this entire document, because it has less to do with macronutrients and more to do with how we think about personal responsibility and public health. For decades, the cultural narrative around obesity and metabolic disease has been one of individual moral failure. If you're overweight, it's because you lack willpower. If you have type 2 diabetes, it's because you made bad choices. If you can't stop eating chips or soda or fast food, it's a personal character flaw. And I want to be very clear, that narrative is wrong. It is demonstrably, scientifically wrong. And the new guidelines are beginning to acknowledge this. We live in what researchers call a food swamp, an environment in which ultra-processed, hyper-palatable, nutritionally bankrupt food is abundant, cheap, heavily marketed, and deliberately engineered to override your brain's natural satiety signals. These products are designed by food scientists with one goal: to make you eat more of them. They exploit the same neurological reward pathways as addictive substances, and they are everywhere. Chronic disease in this context is not a personal failing. It is the predictable, statistically inevitable outcome of placing biologically normal human beings inside a food environment that was never designed with their health in mind. Here's the part that should make you angry, by the way. 98% of government agricultural subsidies go to commodity crops, corn, soy, and wheat, which are the raw materials of the ultra-processed food industry. Only 2% of subsidies go toward fruits and vegetables. The same government that tells you to eat more produce is subsidizing the industry that makes it cheaper and easier to eat chips and soda instead. This is not an accident. This is not an oversight. This is a system that, whatever its original intentions, now functions to produce disease and dependency, while generating enormous profits for the food industry and the pharmaceutical industry that treats the resulting conditions. The encouraging thing, and there is something genuinely encouraging here, is that the conversation around how we pay for healthcare is starting to change. Medicare has recently announced a substantial initiative to fund research on what's called functional lifestyle medicine, essentially using food, movement, sleep, and stress management as primary medical interventions rather than just adjuncts to pharmaceutical treatment. When the data comes in, and based on what we already know, it will, showing that food as medicine dramatically lowers healthcare costs and improves outcomes, the entire financial architecture of the healthcare system will feel pressure to shift from treating symptoms to cultivating health. That shift is slow, and it will be resisted by powerful interests, but it is starting.
Don't forget to hit that subscribe button and join the journey.
So let me pull this all together for you, because I know we covered a lot of ground today. The new dietary guidelines are not a perfect document. They still contain compromises and contradictions, the kind of hedging and equivocation that happens when science collides with economics and politics. But within them are 6 genuine shifts that represent the beginning of a reckoning with decades of bad advice. We are naming ultra-processed food as the enemy. We are acknowledging that food quality matters more than calorie math. We are raising protein targets toward optimal rather than merely adequate. We are letting go of the fear of fat with appropriate nuance. We are starting to acknowledge that many people cannot tolerate carbohydrates the way the standard guidelines assume. And we are beginning to recognize that chronic disease is a systemic problem, not a moral failing. Here's the thing about guidelines, though. They are a floor. They are where policy catches up to science. And policy always lags behind science by years, sometimes decades. You don't have to wait for the next revision. If you want my practical advice, it's actually pretty simple. Eat food that looks like food. Prioritize protein at every meal. Don't fear fat from whole food sources, but be thoughtful about how you pair it. Minimize anything that comes in a package with an ingredient list longer than your grocery receipt. Pay attention to how your body feels after you eat. Bloated, tired, foggy? That is information. Your body is a remarkably sophisticated diagnostic instrument if you learn to listen to it. And most importantly, if something you're eating is making you sick, it doesn't matter what the package says, what the guidelines say, or what anyone tells you. By the most basic definition of the word, food is something that supports the growth and health of an organism. If it's doing the opposite, it's not food. It's just a product. Thank you so much for being here today. If this resonated with you, share it with someone you care about, especially someone who's been struggling with their metabolic health and has been told there's nothing more to do. There is almost always more to do. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.